Welcome to the Early Childhood Voices Conference 2022. My name is Belinda Downey and my presentation today is the key to retention in early childhood education. To begin with, I would like to make an acknowledgement and pay my respects to the traditional owners of country on which I am standing, the Wiradjuri people. As this conference is about early childhood voices, I asked my children to assist me with the acknowledgement.
I'd like to say thank you to the Wiradjuri people for letting us share your land.
We promise to look after it, all the people and animals too. Hello wind, hello sky,
Hello friends.
This presentation is based on research undertaken as part of my PhD dissertation. The research was undertaken in the Northern Territory, Australia, specifically the top end, which is Darwin and surrounding suburbs and towns. Darwin is considered an outer regional location in Australia. The rest of the Northern Territory is considered remote or very remote. Participants included 34 early childhood educators. Yarning sessions, otherwise known as focus group interviews, were undertaken with these educators, which involved open-ended discussions. These sessions focused on the early childhood profession and the participants' role as educators. The methodological approach used for this research was constructivist grounded theory and analysis. The aim of the study was to gain a better understanding of issues facing early childhood educators that may lead to attrition, as well as what educators found fulfilling within the profession that may lead to retention. The two main categories that were generated in the analysis were struggle and hope. The educators who were identified as struggling discussed issues within their job position, their service, and their engagement with early childhood education policy and legislation. The educators who were identified as hopeful discussed the fulfilment they felt around their job position, their service, and the early childhood education legislation and policy. Research on attrition and retention within the Australian early childhood education profession is crucial, as currently the profession faces major workforce shortages. These shortages have occurred due to a range of reasons, including family demographic changes and economic changes, which have created a larger demand for early childhood and therefore a larger demand for early childhood educators. Over 39,000 more educators are required in Australia by 2023. Participants discussed their reasons for entering the early childhood profession. 70% of the participants chose early childhood as a career due to the relationships they had. Early childhood was historically developed to support women and children. As the profession developed, the wages assigned to the role of educators was determined by the skills required to undertake the role. Early childhood educator skills such as ethics, empathy, responsiveness, and caring were historically deemed a proclivity, more of an expression of character or personality, as opposed to a specific skill set. Wages were determined accordingly. This decision in the early 19th century continues to impact early childhood wages and perceptions of the early childhood educator role. Systemic problems have also occurred due to embedded gender roles, traditional and non-traditional gendered careers, access to further education, particularly for women in the 20th century and currently for those living in regional, remote or very remote areas of Australia, such as the NT, as well as the profession being poorly understood outside of the early childhood field, which have all influenced perceptions of the early childhood profession and early childhood educators in the 21st century. These influences are important to understand as early childhood educators enter the profession with existing perceptions of the profession, which can impact their retention and attrition. What this research identified was that retention and attrition had a basic social process, which has been simplified here into 3 stages: becoming a professional, belonging to an organisational culture, and engaging with policy and legislation. Remembering that before educators enter the profession, they already have pre-existing perceptions of what early childhood is and what the role of being an educator means. In the first stage of becoming a professional, it was identified that certain issues were more likely to lead to attrition or turnover in early childhood. Stress was one of the main factors. Both the physical stress of the role, such as lifting children, and the emotional stress of the role, such as supporting an upset child or dealing with an injured child. Stress was also created due to a lack of staff, which created extra pressure in terms of larger workloads and longer hours. There was stress occurring due to competing priorities such as paperwork, cleaning and care. When the children were prioritised, these additional tasks such as paperwork and cleaning were undertaken during unpaid overtime, which further exacerbated stress levels and impacted well-being of educators. Practices that encouraged retention for participants included the intrinsic motivation they felt from supporting children's learning and watching children develop, the positive relationships participants built with the families and the children, which supported their job satisfaction, and the positive workplace ethos participants felt when working with co-workers that provided reciprocal support, which supported participants' well-being. The second stage of belonging to an organisational culture is revisited throughout an educator's career. It simultaneously occurs when educators first become a professional and enters an organisational culture, but the stage is revisited whenever leadership or team changes occur or when an educator moves services. Participants discussed their intention of turnover or attrition when the organisational culture was negative. Negative organisational cultures that were discussed included participants' experiences of horizontal violence. Horizontal violence is a form of harassment that is psychological in nature and creates hostility within teams. Participants' examples of this included co-workers continually escalating concerns to upper management instead of discussing it with the participant, co-workers asserting their opinion through passive-aggressive actions, such as refusing to complete tasks, or co-workers using passive-aggressive verbal comments, such as, "This won't work." Other experiences of negative organisational culture discussed included participants not agreeing educationally with practices that were occurring, but feeling their concerns were not being listened to or acknowledged, or that the organisational culture was such that participants felt unable to express their concerns around practices. Positive organisational cultures were linked with retention. Examples discussed by the participants of positive organisational cultures included co-workers who held similarly aligned, educationally valued practices and philosophies as the participants, organisational cultures that encouraged open and robust, respectful conversations with co-workers and leaders, where critical reflection on practices and procedures occurred, but were supported and mentored, where support and mentoring was also provided in areas that participants felt they needed. The third stage of the process was engagement with legislation and policy. Similarly to stage 2, stage 3 is revisited throughout an educator's career. When new policy frameworks, legislation or reforms occur, this stage would be revisited. Educators also develop their experience and further their knowledge throughout their careers, which creates shifts and revisiting again within this stage. Participants discussed their intention of turnover or attrition when they had difficulty engaging with multiple policy requirements and legislation, such as the Early Years Learning Framework, the regulations, the National Quality Standards, and the National Quality Framework. Participants also discussed issues with understanding the multiple requirements when first entering the profession. Also discussed was the subjective nature of the National Quality Standards, as educators, management, families, policymakers, and authorised officers can all hold differing understandings and interpretations of the standards. For example, educational integrity cannot be ticked on a checklist, but a set number of observations can be, making quality difficult to assess. Pay and working conditions was also a concern for participants, as they noted that the very important work they did was not valued, and that the pay and conditions, including their ability to progress within early childhood, was not enough of an incentive for them to stay long-term in their profession. However, there was hope for participants in the engagement of policy and legislation, which was linked to retention. The terminology within policy, such as the Early Years Learning Framework, advocated for the profession and the professionalism of the educators. This terminology provided participants with the language they needed to help them express the importance of their role and what they do for children and families. Participants discussed using the Early Years Learning Framework as a tool to explain to families why the early years mattered and what their role as educators was. Participants' engagement with policy and legislation also boosted their own confidence in their knowledge and in the value of their role. What this research found was that the influences and impacts on early childhood educator retention, turnover, or attrition in the outer regional Northern Territory were grounded in the connections that educators could make, or whether they could not make them or were not able to make them. The findings from this research suggest that participants were more likely to be retained in the profession when connections were built within a positive organisational culture. These connections included when participants felt educationally aligned with their co-workers and when they trusted that they could seek support or advice from their co-workers and receive it. Connection was built when participants felt encouraged to engage with early childhood policy and legislation, but were also supported and mentored to understand it and why it was important. Connection was built through the development of professional, respectful, and mindful relationships with the children and families the educators worked with. Connection also occurred when communication was clear and open, but also robust and psychologically safe, encouraging participants to be able to critically reflect on their own practices and accountability. Robust conversations also supported participants to consider that there were other ways of thinking and doing. Connection was built when management was ethically aligned with the educational values of the participants and their co-workers, listening to the participants' opinions and providing support where necessary. Finally, connection was built through supportive and well-being-based leadership that considered the participants' individual needs, but also their needs within the larger team and the team's needs together. This type of leadership encouraged autonomy in the participants' decision-making and encouraged values-based approaches to education and care. For example, approaches to teaching that considered gratitude, kindness, and empathy. Therefore, what this research found was that by building connections, we can also build retention.
Thank you for listening. I'm reading your year. Me too. Me too. Me too. Me too. Me too. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening.